want to welcome you to the what has been the newly renamed Francis Lee Utley Memorial Lecture. It used to be just the Fellows Lecture, but in a minute you'll know what's happening with that renaming. Before I do that, this is the 50th anniversary of the Fellows, and I want to thank you for coming to this, which I think you'll find a very illuminating talk from our guest speaker. But also, at 1:30, again as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the Fellows, there is a panel in this room devoted to reflecting on past and future of folklore studies. And so I hope after you go take your lunch break or whatever it is you're going to do over lunch, you'll come back to this room at 1:30 for that panel. So thank you for coming. Welcome to the Francis Lee Utley Memorial Lecture sponsored by the Fellows of the American Folklore Society. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to say a few words about the folklorist whom the Fellows are honoring by newly naming this annual lecture on the occasion of, I'm Jay Meckling, by the way. Pat Turner sort of said to me last night when we were had our reception for the students, "And who are you?" So I always forget to say, I'm Jay Meckling, president of the Fellows, so okay, that's who I am. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to say a few words about the folklorist whom the Fellows are honoring by newly naming this annual lecture on the occasion of the organization's golden anniversary. Francis Lee Utley did his graduate study in literature at Harvard University, where his mentor, Professor of English George Lyman Kittredge, introduced him to the study of folklore. Utley earned his PhD in 1934 and joined the English department at The Ohio State University the next year. He also taught at UC Berkeley and UCLA as visiting professor of folklore. Utley's highly respected scholarship in folk narrative, onomastics, medieval literature, and dialect still sets a high standard for work in folklore and literature. He was literally a defining figure for folklore with his oft-cited and anthologized essay, Folk Literature and Operational Definition, which appeared in the Journal of American Folklore in 1961. He was president of the American Folklore Society in 51-52, and toward the goal of establishing folklore as a discipline and raising its visibility, Utley felt that the AFS needed an honorary organization to recognize folklore scholars for their contributions to the field and to complement other honorary organizations in other disciplines. So in 1960, Utley wrote the founding document of the Fellows and served as the body's first chair. By naming the annual lecture sponsored by the Fellows after this founder, we acknowledge his contributions to the field as a scholar, teacher, and organizational leader. And you can recognize the Fellows at this meeting by the ribbons on their name badges. And I'd just like to ask the Fellows present to please stand just briefly. Thank you. If you attend any meeting of an historical association, most of the people will have their degrees in history and teach in history departments. Attend an MLA meeting, God help you. And you're among people with degrees in the study of literature working in departments of English and literature. A sociology meeting, sociologists. Psychology meeting, psychologists. An anthropology meeting, anthropologists, and so on. Yet as people who study groups and their cultures, we know that the most important, exciting, and creative events in those cultures tend to occur not at the centers, but on the peripheries, where a culture bumps into difference, where it changes merely by interacting with something different. Despite the lip service given to interdisciplinarity by people in the disciplines, most scholars are complicit in building the walls meant to protect the castle keep, that is, the pure and authentic core of a discipline. Now, although folklore has flirted with that tendency towards orthodoxy, we can be proudest, I think, or at least I'm proudest, when the field practices the open interdisciplinarity that makes it active, alert, alive, and exciting. Sure, there are people in this room with degrees in folklore, but there are also people with degrees in literature, linguistics, art history, music, classics, history, anthropology, rhetoric, sociology, American studies, psychology, and social psychology. That last field has always been an interdisciplinary wellspring for me, speaking personally, beginning with my study with a social psychologist in grad school at Penn. Gary Allen Fine is one of the finest, you've never heard that before, have you? Gary Allen Fine is one of the finest practitioners of that interdisciplinary way of thinking. After earning his BA in psychology at Penn in 1952, Gary's going to share some personal stories when he and Utley were together in 1952. After earning his BA in psychology at Penn in 1972, with plenty of folklore courses from Dan Benemos, Roger Abrams, as well as coursework from Del Himes, David Sapir, Irving Goffman, and Ray Birdwhistle, Gary went on to Harvard to earn his PhD in social psychology. Gary is the John Evans Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University, where he moved in 1997 after professorships in sociology at the University of Georgia from 1990 to 97 and the University of Minnesota before that in 1976 to 1990. He's held numerous prestigious visiting professorships over the years, including at the University of Bremen, University of Iceland, the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria, South Africa, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the University of Cardiff. He has had research fellowships at King's College, Cambridge, the Rockefeller Center, a Study Center in Bellagio, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, and the Smithsonian. He had a fellowship at the Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in 1994-95, and he's there again this year. Gary's interdisciplinary credentials at Northwestern are evident in the connections he has to the Alice Berlin Kaplan Humanities Institute there, and his active participation in the interdisciplinary doctoral program in theater and drama. He's an associate faculty member in the Northwestern American Studies program. He served the profession through many memberships and offices, including sections of the American Sociological Association, the International Sociological Association, the Society for the Study of Symbolic Interaction, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, the American Folklore Society, and the Association for the Study of Play. He was elected a Fellow of the AFS in 1994. Gary is an immensely productive scholar. You can tell from the range of topics of his books and articles that he brings his repertoire of ideas and methods to subjects and questions that genuinely fascinate him. He has written or co-authored or edited 28 books, and they are still coming. His first book, Rumor and Gossip, The Social Psychology of Hearsay, in 1976, co-authored with Ralph Rosnow, established early his reputation as a scholar of rumor and legend, a topic he has never left behind, publishing Manufacturing Tales in 1992, Difficult Reputations in 2001, Whispers on the Color Line with Pat Turner in 2001, and Rumor Mills in 2005, co-edited with Veronique Campion, Vincent, and Chip Heath, and most recently, and there was a flyer out there for it, The Global Grapevine, Why Rumors of Terrorism, Immigration, and Trade Matter, which was just published in June, I think, with Bill Ellis, co-authored with Bill Ellis. Gary is a skilled ethnographer. He literally wrote the book, and I mean literally wrote the book, on doing field work with children, his book, Knowing Children. His 1983 book, think about this when you hear what it's about. Shared Fantasy, Role-Playing Games as Social Worlds, deserves a special place in the history of the now burgeoning scholarship on electronic gaming and virtual worlds. Gary was there first, even before it was electronic. His own Little League experience as a kid brought him back to study the boys' culture of that sport, resulting in With the Boys, an engaging ethnographic study that addresses issues in sociology, psychology, anthropology, and folklore. He probably still holds the record for compiling the longest and most comprehensive list of dirty talk by pre-adolescent boys. Like any good folklorist of children's cultures, Gary uses his own sons as informants. No boards to go through for permission. It's the beauty of it when you do children's folklore. And when one of his sons plunged into high-powered high school debate, Gary produced an ethnography of that debate world entitled Gifted Tongues, High School Debate and Adolescent Culture. Another hot field, food and culture studies, already acknowledges the importance of Gary's 1996 ethnographic study, Kitchens, the Culture of Restaurant Work, not least because food studies is so text-centered and lacks so many examples of skilled ethnographic work of the sort that Gary does. Meteorologists in their world drew his attention for his 2007 book, Authors of the Storm, and I'll not even try to summarize the range of his journal articles and book chapters, except to say that there are more than 200 that he identifies on his CV as related to sociology and social psychology, nearly 100 more in other categories, and over 3 dozen he identifies as centrally about folklore, although certainly the ones in the other fields are also of interest to folklorists and about folklore. He is as interested in theory as he is in ethnographic details. He's the complete scholar. My guess is that Gary's Utley lecture today will make you wish you took some social psychology classes, or just read Gary's books. The title of his lecture is The Folklore of Small Things, Tiny Publics, and Realms of Local Knowledge. Please welcome Gary Allen Fine.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much for being here. Jay, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I think speakers generally should not annotate the introductions that they are given. But in this case, I have to make one annotation, because otherwise it might become a legend. And I don't want it to be so. Jay pointed out, or I should say claimed, that I used my children as my informants. And he cited the example of my son Todd, who was in fact a national champion debater. But I did not do my research because he was a debater. Rather, the connection went in the other direction. He became a debater because he saw a videotape of the final round of the National Debate Tournament. This was back when he was in 3rd grade, and he looked at it, he watched it through for an hour or so, and he said, I want to do that. And then when he got to high school, he did, and he was remarkably successful at it. And it brings me back to my days with Irving Goffman. Now, I was married in 1972. Back in those days, some of us old-timers will remember that you graduated from college, and then rather than go off and have a good time for years and years, you settled down and got married. And, well, you could have a good time when you were married, too, but not with a lot of different women, unless you were in a certain sect of Mormonism, I suppose. At any rate, so I was going to get married, and my wife is from a quite prominent Jacksonville, Florida family. And I suggested to Professor Goffman, to Irving, that I study my own wedding, because it would be a fascinating example of impression management, I thought. And indeed it was. Indeed it was. We had, both families thought their children were marrying down. And perhaps they were both wrong, that we were both marrying up, but that remains to be seen. At any rate, Irving listened to me, and he sat quietly for a moment, and then he turned to me and he said, you know, only a schmuck would study his own life. And so at that point, I put that aside, and I learned from Irving that never have I studied my own family, never have I studied the activities of my kids. They, in some cases, became interested in what I was doing. All right, this is a very special occasion for me because it was 1973. Some few of you in this room will remember that the American Folklore Society had its meetings here in Nashville, not at such a spiffy hotel, but here in Nashville, and it was my first AFS meeting. And I was slotted for to be the first speaker on the first day, and it was my first meeting, so people didn't know me, with very few exceptions. Looking out over this audience, contrasting it to the 3 people in the audience back in 1973, I can say truly how this field has grown. It is wonderful to be here. Now, the task of a keynote speaker is an easy one. It is to select a theme for which he or she has already become known, and then to repeat that theme as if there were no other option. After 37 years as a member of this congregation, I have been appointed to speak because of a belief among the Fellows Selection Committee that I have acquired some measure of expertise, and that my lecture should reveal that preoccupation. Of course, there is no shortage of keynote speakers, each with his or her own obsessions. For your part, you are attending at least in part because the Fellows Lecture is an event, an occasion in which the largest concerns of our discipline are exposed and are twisted. And like every keynote speaker, I am an odd choice. And perhaps particularly in this case, it is especially so. I am, as Jay pointed out, a social psychologist and a sociologist. As a folklorist, I am something of a shapeshifter. I can wear my mentors on my sleeve: Dan Benamos, Roger Abrams, Albert Lord, Alan Dundas, and of course, Linda Daig. And I can wave my diploma with its advertisement that my PhD minor is, in fact, in folklore and mythology. No matter that I have never taught an undergraduate course in those fields, although admittedly such courses are becoming less readily found. Perhaps I justify my lecture by the fact that folklorists need all the friends that they can get. And we cannot afford to be too choosy as to their provenance. In light of my position as an insider and an outsider, I intend to draw upon concerns that have inspired me throughout my career. Today, I focus on the cultures and the traditions of small groups and link these microcultures to the examination of cultures of expertise, especially within occupational fields. My plan for this address is to lay out an argument for the importance of group cultures and then discuss how within the group individuals have different realms of expert knowledge and how groups themselves have different realms of expert knowledge within a network of groups that ultimately constitutes a society. From this, I return to my discussion of the importance of microcultures in constituting civil society. Now, in making these arguments, I combine insights from sociology, my home discipline, and folkloristics, my beloved discipline. I believe that by seeing culture as embedded in interacting groups, we can appreciate the processes through which tradition is diffused in larger societies. Further, by treating culture as linked to recognized status domains, we can appreciate the distinction between lay knowledge and expert knowledge. I draw upon my 8 different ethnographies when appropriate, and these are studies, Jay mentioned some of them, of Little League Baseball, Dungeons and Dragons, restaurant kitchens, mushroomers, high school debate, folk art collecting, professional meteorology, and my current project is a study of competitive chess. I draw upon these examples when appropriate, although at a certain point lunch will call. We will recognize that if we were biologically inclined. And so as a result, I will keep my references brief. As folklorists, we must continually question our key terms. And so I ask, along with Alan Dundas, who are the folk? The question of the boundaries of knowledge and of social relations must be at the heart of cultural analysis. I focus on how arenas of action, social relations, and collective pasts each shape the creation of folklore in small groups. And I want to begin by talking about these arenas of action. My title, The Folklore of Small Things, plays off the concerns of social theorist Jeffrey Goldfarb, who entitled a recent book, The Politics of Small Things. It is an elegant book. It is, in fact, a small book, but an elegant one, to which I direct your attention. Goldfarb contends that before we examine what is said, we must examine where it is said. What is the arena of action? Goldfarb's perspective emphasizes the controlling force of context. Goldfarb starts by theorizing the kitchen table, a microcultural space. His essential point is not simply that small, mundane cultures need to be theorized, but that it is the conditions of the environment under which they are produced that provide for allegiance and shared traditions. Through their tight-knit cultures, these domains motivate certain forms of action. The locale provides the basis for both social relations and the content of group life. In Goldfarb's words, quote, "When friends and relatives met in their kitchens, they presented themselves to each other in such a way that they defined the situation in terms of an independent frame rather than that of officialdom." In other words, they set up their own civil society, their own micro-civil society. In other words, they constitute a folk community or a public sphere that is separate from official cultures. Flowing from the hearth, a framework of meaning is established that abounds with the agentic responsibility of the group. The group is the agent. Communities can come to see their spaces, their microcultures, and their place in it in ways that have recursive effects. Goldfarb sees the hearth as a central space in the resistance against Eastern European authoritarianism. And so it was. But kitchens and porches are found throughout the globe as meeting points in which primary relations are bolstered and where discourse and tradition provides for modes of responding to local challenges. Hearths are widely dispersed, each with their own folk culture that provides a remembered and a referential past. What Goldfarb is examining is consistent with the earlier arguments of the German social theorist Jürgen Habermas. Habermas argues that there exist spaces that provide for discussions that together constitute an independent political public sphere, separate from institutional sources of power. These discussions, suggests Habermas, can be found in bookstores, salons, clubs, and even public meetings. In such small places, participants can assume that others will share a history, they'll share emotional contours, and a sense of belonging. They are, in other words, locales of likeness. They're tiny publics, small cultures of shared interest and experience, and they provide the basis of civil society and the creation of a shared and robust culture. This argument helps us recognize that just as individuals may colonize places, in the words of social theorist Anthony Giddens, places may come to colonize individuals. In other words, the locations imply which performances are appropriate. Behaviors, thoughts, and emotions are generated and performed as a consequence of the symbolic meaning of space. We believe that churches demand quiet attentiveness, that schoolrooms promote ordered participation, and that taverns encourage sociable engagement. An ongoing interaction scene requires locales where individuals regularly gather with their expectations intact. Through the recognition of location, rules become tacit, and places serve as invitations to a particular definition of the situation. From experience in similar domains, participants eventually develop shared expectations of what performances are permissible. This proves to be an important point emphasized by those folklorists who helped to develop the performative approach to culture, such as Barbara K.G. Culture is not something that can be presented at all times, but it requires contextualization. Humor is a good example of a genre that demands the recognition of the normative requirements of space. As Michaela DeSoucy and I have pointed out, the forms of joking that are possible depend on sets of norms. For example, in the government meteorological office that I studied, workers had to be sensitive to the requirements of the place so that their teasing of coworkers, which frequently occurred, such as men teasing women, is not constituted as sexual harassment. So at this Weather Service office that I studied, this teasing was evident in joking between the male meteorologists, and all the meteorologists there were male at this particular office, and two lower status female employees. These women kept small aquariums filled with tropical fish on their desk, and the men would jokingly, I put jokingly in quotation marks, although the participants would feel that it's joking, that they would jokingly threaten to, quote, do things to the fish, such as conducting experiments on them, hooking them up to electrodes, or even, at one memorable occasion, threatening to send them out into space. Get a one of these rocket ships and send the fish up to see if fish could survive in zero gravity. On one occasion, they even placed a ransom note on one of the woman's desk. While one might see this as a metaphor of sexual violation, the parties to the play considered it all in good fun. And let me just make an ethnographic note. When I suggested, this was towards the end of my research, fortunately, when I suggested that this seemed to me to be an example of symbolic rape, and I suspect that people in this audience would feel that that was a reasonable interpretation, many of you. Maybe not Elliot, but many of the rest of you. The reaction was not entirely positive. It was sort of rolling one's eyes and saying, oh, these academics. Fortunately, I had enough idiosyncrasy credits that I could get away with it. Although in the book, I had that in the first draft, and I changed that to be a little lighter, but hopefully still making the point. Now, women could and did joke about their own bodily endowments in this space, in noting, for example, that some cloud formations looked like breasts. But men could not do the same without an implicit invitation. Now, in bars or other playful gatherings, the latitude of teasing is wider. The tavern space, the bar space, erases much litigation because it is assumed that the expectations for the rules of propriety are different, are broader in that case. So now I turn to social relations, relations in public, in Goffman's terms. And I note that the small group is a nexus point for individuals to gather together, making personal interests into common interests, turning personality into community. As such, the folklore of groups involves a social cartography. The centrality of performance is one indicator that we are witnessing tradition in the making. However, not everything that is performed is, by that fact alone, within the domain of folklore. We must not be so expansive, so intellectually imperialist, as to demand that everything to be contained within our realm. In part, the self-referential quality of a performance by those who constitute a community is one indicator of the boundaries of folklore. Folklore is to be found through the intersection of arenas of action, a set of recognized relations, often tied to specialized pools of knowledge, and the recognition of a shared history and linked fate, tied to a division of labor in the group. A performance scene is constituted by social ties as much as by material conditions. These relations determine those topics and genres that participants feel are appropriate. Different groups and networks maintain local standards for what is seen as appropriate in the setting, and these can include rude jokes, gossipy stories, grisly legends, or epic sagas. The nature of the participants and their social relations shape the content and the style of performance. In other words, it is not simply being in a bar that determines what performances will occur, but who is present, what are their intentions, and what are the contents of their ties. Does the relationship involve a sexual pickup? Is it a group of buddies who are playing drinking games? Or is it a mixed-gendered group of workmates winding down after a hectic week? What it is, what kind of group it is, determines the performance that one will find. The content of the relationships determine the local contours of performance, in other words. For instance, at offices of the National Weather Service, the work culture in the office depended on those who were on duty and the degree of friendship among them. The office could be raucous with joking about mad scientist experiments, and these meteorologists loved to use the microwave for various non-meteorological experiments, even breaking it at one point as it caught on fire in their games. So if the right people are there, and a meteorological office is the 24/7 office, which means there is a night shift between 11 o'clock and 7 in the morning, and all kinds of things go on there. Sometimes sleep, but sometimes these experiments. Or the office, if different people are on duty, could be quietly contemplative, only punctuated by technical meteorological jargon. Buddies would tease each other with gusto, while those with more strained relations would work quietly. Examining numerous groups within the same cultural field, whether Little League baseball teams, kitchen crews, or local meteorological offices, underlines that relations among participants shape group cultures. Friendships encourage certain traditions, while distance eliminates others. Some Little League baseball teams have recognized leaders who help adult coaches install instrumental values by creating customs or rituals. For example, rules about who can chew gum, or when they can chew gum, or which baseball cheers to use on particular occasions. Now, on other teams, with different structures, other leaders serve as counter-hegemonic rebels, undercutting the authority of the coach through joking and sarcastic comments. And still other teams lack a consensual leader, and because of uncertain status relations, the team struggles with commitment. In such cases, there are no traditions that persuade the players that they are part of the same unit. So the structure of the team, the relationships, matter very much in terms of the creation of these cultures. The culture of a tiny group of restaurant workers embedded in their steamy, hot kitchens are shaped by whether the head chef, promotes emotional stability and interpersonal harmony among the crowded group of workers, and whether workers accept these claims, often through validation, again, in teasing and joking. There are jokes in all kitchens, despite variations in these jokes' emotional tenor. The content and the emotional resonance can differ dramatically. As the relations within a social space affect the content of performance, it simultaneously shapes identity, which then, through an indirect process, will further shape the content of action and the extent of commitment to the culture. The importance of voluntary scenes for the analysis of folklore in contemporary society is salient in this regard. For a folk culture to develop, it is not sufficient that people choose activities that they enjoy, but they should enjoy those who share their interests. Leisure groups benefit when they emphasize the pleasure in each other's company, a crucial incentive for collective action in the face of personal costs. As one leader repeated in my study of political action scenes, that his goal as a partisan in American politics, his goal was to make his party a, quote, party. That is, for everyone to enjoy being present. Group organizers rely on rituals of pleasure to create affiliation and then create identity, cementing a commitment that validates the behaviors of others. This recognition of the need to link satisfaction to affiliation is central to solving what the economist Mancur Olson termed the free rider problem. The problem in group life is to ensure that those who will reap the benefits of a movement will participate actively in that movement, contributing their resources, even though they will also receive the benefits if the group succeeds and they do nothing. So for instance, if you wanted to get a stoplight put up on a street near your home, or if you felt the need to put up a stoplight, well, if there's a group that will do it for you, you can just sit back and wait, not go to meetings and so forth, then that is, you're being essentially a free rider. And the question is how to get people involved in the movement and contribute resources. And the answer that Olson suggests is to recognize that interpersonal affection can overcome the costs of participation. The analysis of pleasure, the analysis of fun, dependent on the desire to be with others, is integral to the recognition of how local structures are stabilized, building congenial rituals. Social relations provide the conditions for the diffusion of local culture. And now I turn to my third issue, and that is the role of shared history. Each ongoing gathering develops an idioculture, a set of references that permits group members to identify themselves as a meaningful micro-community. Groups as focus domains establish collective memories that define the group to participants. As the sociologist Harvey Malech emphasizes, communities have their features set through a shared recognition of local character and tradition that shapes subsequent decisions. This is what he terms a rolling inertia. That is, once a group situates itself with its own culture, then that culture continues as a form of what we would call tradition. The common past that a group has experienced or to which new members have been socialized is crucial in that shared meaning constructs the boundaries of the group, separating insiders from outsiders and defining how members imagine their linked futures. Beyond their material structure, groups revel in shared experiences. Stories and anecdotes stand at the heart of group life, as communities have the purpose, in Hayden White's terms, of translating knowing into telling. Discourse woven around the stories provides a moral basis of community. To establish collective selfhood, the past must be incorporated into an insistent present, cementing the group's recall by emphasizing that to narrate is to belong to a group. This is evident in joking cultures as humor underscores common references, bolstering the continuation of social interaction. Humorous performance provides more than momentary laughs, but is, in fact, a link to group history, providing a power that evanescent merriment will lack. Group culture has what Irving Goffman speaks of as a referential afterlife. For a time, cultural elements can be shared with the belief that others will comprehend what is meant. In this sense, each reference is set in time. Even if lacking formal rituals, group culture is grounded in history and in memory. However, as Goffman emphasizes, what is recalled is not eternal. It gets forgotten. What is remembered and is repeated at one moment can fall out of memory later. Through the shifting of personnel, as in restaurant kitchens with staff turnover, or in high school clubs with rising student cohorts, group culture alters while remaining recognizable. Group culture is also forward-looking in that cultural tools are available for groups to confront collective challenges. As culture becomes elaborated, the range of the group as meaning maker is expanded. Social life is an ongoing project, not a momentary scene. Thus, identity becomes critically important as groups socialize new members. By participating in chess clubs, novice members, although not necessarily novice players, but new members of the club, learn expectations for the preferred amount of talk during games and the proper response to victory and defeat. Adolescents in fantasy gaming groups learn which fantasies to keep to themselves. Right, and that's very important. Through these performances and their public acquiescence, participants reveal themselves as desiring to belong to the group. Folklore provides the basis for shared expectations, critical to collective comfort. Since ambiguity has a social cost, groups create routine practices that maximize clarity. Relying on tradition, most groups promote continued interaction over systemic ruptures. Members expect that the themes of interaction tomorrow will be similar to the themes of interaction today, and in this, they are usually correct. As social theorist Edward Shills emphasizes, tradition and ritual, both on the societal level and on the local level, are essential to social organization, whether in the daily meetings of restaurant cooks, in gatherings on the mound in Little League Baseball, or in the collective identification of mushrooms after a foray. Ultimately, traditions build on each other. The more rituals in a group, the more new or elaborate rituals that will follow. In other words, culture produces culture. Idiosyncratic actions become practices when they are treated as serving group needs. Once neophytes can read this interactional grammar, they are treated as competent members, differentiated from those outside group boundaries. As Elliot Oring, now I'm going to praise Elliot, properly reminded us, even the most minute social units, such as couples and families, develop local cultures that encourage that future practices build on those previously established. No matter how small the group, how small the folk community, they still develop cultures and traditions. They buffer participants from external demands, and these practices reify group history, setting the terms for propriety and creating structure from talk. Yet a critic might point to the very smallness and the apparent randomness of those cultural forms. In group life, we often find unpredictable events that spark common knowledge. These triggering events cannot be guessed, but neither are they random. Events that shape collective life are readily predictable after they occur. That is, when we read society backwards. But they cannot be predicted before they occur, looking forwards. However, once they are seen as relevant for group identity, actors scramble to shape their behavior, aligning ongoing action with group culture. Even if we cannot predict the moments of everyday life, such as jokes, insults, flubs, or queries, when they occur, participants incorporate them into an orderly meaning system. And this commitment to stability, the devotion to the smooth flow of action, allows actors to feel confident in their tacit expectations, even as new interpretations are generated. Now, all of this emphasis on group culture is good and proper, but our theme this year is to examine cultures of expertise. And we recognize that groups and individuals operate within a division of labor. Any broader social system requires that domains of expertise be established. A complex social world requires specialization, but this specialization is not simply instrumental, but it's social, emotional, and cultural. Individuals and groups can define themselves as being specialists in particular domains. Crucial to the establishment of specialization is the drawing of boundaries that are defended by a set of traditions. The idea that there exist genre specialists is not, of course, a novel one in folkloristics. Certainly, the claim can be traced back to Carl von Sydow, among other European ethnologists. More recently, Linda Daig and Andrew Vajny spoke of multi-conduit transmission of folklore. By this, they meant that within a social group, there emerge both individuals and networks that specialize in certain genres. They become experts within particular domains of performance. Thinking about expertise, we recognize that it can refer to three different realms. First, the expert can be a person who has specialized knowledge in some area. These knowledgeable figures within a social system constitute what I label connoisseurs. They have the ability to evaluate a particular topic, even if they lack skills for competent performance. The second form of expertise is that of the performer, who presents but need not evaluate the contents of an expressive domain. And this is the sense in which Daig and Vajny used their concept. Thus, one can have an expert in singing ballads, performing epics, or sharing dirty jokes, perhaps without the ability to evaluate critically other performances. The third form of expertise is that of the individual whose instrumental knowledge is required by a community for carrying out the central features that are necessary for the smooth operation of that social system. These individuals can be referred to as authorities. It is on this third dimension that the folklore of expertise most directly connects to the folklore of modern society. The folkloric analysis of the domain of expertise must properly involve each of these dimensions. And this is the challenge at our conclave this weekend. The folklore of expertise involves a recognition that evaluation and performance are not evenly spread throughout society, but are linked to certain knowledge domains. For the remainder of this talk now, I briefly examine each of these three forms of expertise. So first I look at the connoisseur. Within a modern society, a wealth of possible domains of knowledge exists, so many that none of us can hope to have competence in all of them. And so individuals must choose where to invest their time and energy. And when they do so, they typically use that knowledge to gain esteem and credibility in their group cultures. In the course of my 35 years of research, my 35 years of field research, I have examined several of these esoteric domains, notably collectors of folk art and hunters of mushrooms. Folklore is based on shared knowledge that is attached to a self-referential community, a set of individuals who recognize the boundaries between inside and outside. These boundaries are believed to separate worlds of knowledge and, in fact, often do so. In this sense, expertise requires participation within a community of knowledge, not just knowing things, but participating in a community that is interested in those things. When I observed the world of amateur mycologists, I rapidly recognized a status hierarchy that depended upon a deep and rich knowledge of mushrooms, permitting the presentation and the validation of material that was meaningful to the local community. The knowledge that was available served as an important resource for the continuation of group activities. To be confident that a mushroom was edible and to invest trust in a local knowledge broker, that is a person who offered you that mushroom, that knowledge broker bridged structural holes in knowledge regimes, and it benefits the local community by establishing a recognition of this expertise. Throughout many social worlds, we discover parallel relationships of expertise and trust. And trust, I think, is a concept that we need to make central in our examination of expertise. Individuals choose to invest time and effort in the acquisition of knowledge, which they then exchange with their colleagues for tokens of esteem and marks of deference. As I pointed out in Morel Tales, my mushroom book, when mycological societies hold forays, they routinely establish a formal group of, quote, experts whose responsibility it is to examine the mushrooms that are collected and to identify them. When mushroom clubs hold potluck dinners, the activities demand that fears for one's health and even for one's life be put aside because of the public validation of status. In other words, if you go to one of these potlucks and you are offered a dish of these mushrooms, well, you don't know where they came from. You pretty much have to eat them unless you want to insult the person who gave them to you. And that desire, this insistence on eating these mushrooms is a function of the trust that you put in a system of expert knowledge. So some experts are given the authority to know, and the group depends on this authority. This work and the esteem that goes with it is not simply book learning, although scientific knowledge certainly does play a role. Rather, it is a form of local practice, a form that has the hallmarks of folklore. Knowledge is linked to communities, and it is typically acquired through interpersonal communication, especially through face-to-face connections. While we should not divide scientific knowledge from lay knowledge too forcibly, knowledge in many publics depends on shared experience and the informal diffusion of knowledge. In mushrooming, as in bird watching, art collecting, rock hounding, and many other worlds, linkages to communal sources of information are critical. Behind the gathering of information, sharing this expertise is also social. So I talk a little bit here about the problems of buying a car. And so often when we have to choose which car to purchase, we will rely on not just the official blue books, but on our networks of friends. So-called word-of-mouth advice is influential, and the term itself reveals the relevance of folklore for this form of knowledge. And the power of social media, such as Facebook and others, reveals the power of personal expertise. Ultimately, expertise is not located in minds, not located in brains, but in shared scenes. One doesn't have expertise, but rather one shares it or performs it. A knowledgeable person who keeps information to him or herself is not truly an expert, because the local community is unaware and will not share in this knowledge. So now I turn to the second form of expertise as display of the role of the performer. The first form of expertise depends on a specialized domain of knowledge to which others wish access. In that instance, the expert is an information broker, but performance itself can justify expertise. Over the course of its history, folklorists have emphasized the skills and the abilities of performers, and some of our greatest works do precisely this. Whether we talk about the contributions of Albert Lord or Linda Daig, two of my mentors, we folklorists recognize that specialized ability permit the display and the diffusion of folklore, and that there must be paths to the socialization of performance. Storytellers, epic singers, carvers, balladeers, and jokesters all have specific skills. While this view of expertise is sometimes linked to selection by personality, we need not, in fact, we should not, only adopt a reductionist psychological perspective. Rather, abilities are assigned through a social system, through slots for performers of different genres. A society that maintains a traditional genre desires and encourages individuals with appropriate skills. You need to find someone who will tell those legends, who will perform those epic songs. And so there will be opportunities for skill acquisitions, sometimes through apprenticeship. Open slots call out for performers. Otherwise, genres might be lost. The desire to witness particular performances is based on the recognition of expertise. Small groups do not sponsor all performances, but are selective in their choices. Some performances have the ability to draw an audience within a local community. And so now I turn to the third form of expertise, that is expertise as domain or the case of the authority. So a third way to conceptualize expertise is to treat it in light of an institutional pool of knowledge. As I noted, within complex society, some individuals have the authority to know. Over the years, my research here has examined the life worlds of cooks and of meteorologists, two occupations in which there exists specialized and folk knowledge that derives from their work positions. These are domains that are separated from other citizens, in which trust is located not so much in the person, in any given meteorologist or any given cook, but in the fact that the worker has been credentialed within an institutional structure. And here I know I sound very much like a sociologist. Contemporary society depends upon overlapping domains of expertise, organizations and occupations, each with their own group culture and tricks of the trade. Part of these pools of knowledge involves a recognition of boundaries that separate those with skills and with authority from those who are served by those insiders. While we often speak of the professions, law, medicine, religion, as having a core body of knowledge, both technical and social, all work worlds have their own traditions and cultures. As I examined meteorologists and cooks, I discovered the presence of cultures of expertise. Both occupations had what we call workarounds, make-dos, and inside techniques to make their work proceed easier, learned through their work environments and through the sharing of local cultures. Meteorologists, for example, spoke of rules of thumb or finesse rules that were part of their oral culture. For example, in summer, forecasters believe that adding 10 degrees to the 10 a.m. temperature provides a suitable estimate for the high temperature of the day, quick and dirty, and close enough for government work. And cooks also had their techniques that those outside of the kitchen were often unaware of, such as baking meat in the oven, only placing it on the grill for the last few minutes to provide grill marks that allowed customers to believe that, in fact, the meat was grilled as advertised rather than simply baked. Such examples of smoothing the conditions of work belong to folk traditions that are hidden within occupational boundaries. As we have long recognized as a discipline, work domains constitute folk communities. The expertise that is evident is not simply the technical matter of acquiring formal skills, but of learning informal skills of workplace competence. One must display that one is the kind of worker that one is expected to be. This is cultural production, and it is identity work, both of which are within the domain of the folklorist. Ultimately, expertise belongs not only to an individual with skills and with motivations, but to groups and communities in which expertise is embedded. And so now I conclude. I am grateful to have been loaned this bully pulpit for an hour of your lives at a meeting at which we discuss the folklore of expertise. For this moment, I have drawn from my own expertise as a sociologist and a folklorist. My presentation has two linked goals. First, I have argued that folklore is ultimately dependent on small group life, and that we folklorists need to borrow from the group dynamics tradition in social psychology. People live in a world of microcultures that allow culture and social relations to be connected. We reside in tiny publics. We feel at home in groups because it is there that we can access shared pasts, and it is there that we can imagine common futures. Of course, larger communities exist, but these should be conceived as being grounded in a network of linked groups. Society is built upon these local communities. As the sociologist Tamatsu Shibatani pointed out, culture areas are coterminous with communication channels. The recognition of the local context of folklore provides the grounding for an understanding of expertise. Expertise is knowledge that is enacted by individuals and groups to which audiences have given authority. Expertise consists both of knowledge, that is, translations of the world into more accessible language, and also performance, that is, presentations that are valued in themselves. Expertise consists of knowing and of doing. Further, these forms of knowing and doing are often situated within groups that have been assigned status rights in a process that legitimates expertise, by which individuals gain stable and continuing authority through their roles, rather than having to fight for it at each moment. Ultimately, folklore is a discipline that connects to local cultures and to the recognition that individuals and groups construct joint meaning. While as a discipline, we have moved from a singular focus on face-to-face interaction as we recognize the power of mass mediation, we realize that the connections among people and groups permit civil society to be an ongoing enterprise. This recognition of the power of tradition and the power of identity is our disciplinary birthright. Shared pasts and imagined futures belong to us. Thank you.
We have a microphone in the center aisle, so if someone would like to start us off with a comment or a question for Gary, please step to the center aisle and to that microphone. So who's going to break the ice here?
Yes.
Hi, Gary. Enjoyed your talk, and I like the kind of architecture that you've sketched out for us. But I do find, as a folklorist, and only secondarily as a sociologist, or maybe that's tertiary for me, I do find something missing, and I know that you're capable of addressing it. And what I'm looking for is something about the vitality of, shall we say, the vitality and the liberating power of play, of performance, of creativity. I don't think the word creativity appeared even once in your talk, and that's not necessarily a cardinal sin, but in other words...
just a venial sin.
Yeah, maybe. But I wonder if you could supply, or at least try to make some kind of connection to that dimension, which is implicit for me in your talk, but not explicit.
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that, I think you're probably right that I didn't use the word creativity as such, but I certainly talked about the construction of local cultures. And in the construction of local cultures, and in the case of performances, you know, that certainly will involve creativity. The issue that I am particularly concerned with, I guess where I'm trying to think how I can pick a fight. So the way that I would do this, even though obviously as someone who has studied play for these 3-4 decades, I'm in a lot of sympathy with what you're saying. What I was trying to get at was the institutionalization of creativity, not the moment of creation, but the moments after creation. The way that an idea, the way that a form of play, the way that an example of creativity gets embedded in group life, gets embedded as a form of tradition. And it is quite true, if I was looking at origins, I would be talking more about, you know, those systems by which ideas are constituted in the first place. And in fact, I have written about the establishment of small group cultures and the importance of shared knowledge in creating the conditions under which triggering events, that is, creation, gets established.
Good morning, and thank you for your talk. Sean Galvin. A question about Web 2.0. You mentioned Facebook very briefly. A recent study in the New York Times, kids would rather text than talk on the telephone. I, as a parent, have noticed that even on my telephone bills. Their numbers of minutes have gone down, but the texting has gone up almost fourfold. What can you make of this? Where do we find, how are we going to draw the line on the expertise and the whole continuum with the Web 2.0, especially with this generation?
Right. Well, I mean, it's certainly the case that, you know, this is a domain that we folklorists have particular expertise to examine, because what is happening in Web 2.0 or texting or Facebook or other social media is that people are creating, we're watching them create their own traditions, their own cultures. And so, for instance, if you look at texting, all the, you know, those of us of a certain age, as one might speak of it, we had to figure out what OMG meant. And, you know, it sounded like Office of Management and something. But, you know, and the various other forms of communication, the emoticons, you know, this is our domain. This is what, you know, this is the lifeblood of our field. And it is certainly the case, as, you know, those of us who have been interested in contemporary folklore in any of its genres, you know, so if you talk about telephones, well, you know, when this society was first organized, we might have had someone like yourself stand up and say, well, this new thing, this telephone, is changing the whole way that we wouldn't have called them teenagers then, but that young people would communicate with each other, and that they're, now no longer meet face to face, but they do it over this strange online thing called the telephone. So we folklorists should be open and readily focused on new forms of technology as they relate to traditions and cultures.
But are you suggesting we're going to have to lay down again the continuum from lay to expert, because the Facebook is no longer the micro community that we would enjoy in this small setting, but across the world, or the tweets or any other of these chosen forms?
Well, I think there are always forms of mass communication, or, for past century of various forms of mass communication. The question is, where do those mass communication forms connect to small communication forms? So Facebook, if I put something on my Facebook page, it's not, billions of people don't see it. My friends see it. And my friends, may be 50, 100, 200 people. That's still within the realm of a small community. That's within the realm of a fairly small size high school senior class, would have 200-300 students in it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Gary, I appreciate your talk very much. I appreciate especially your addressing fellow folklorists and thereby creating a group here this morning. As you spoke, I thought back to the concept of interpretive community, which was thrown into circulations a generation ago by Stanley Fish. Mm-hmm. Stanley Fish had no interest in the kind of thing that you're looking at, had no interest in looking at real interpretive communities, which folklorists do all the time. But one of the consequences of that concept for him was that he pointed out that academic people, for example, constitute an interpretive community who have the illusion that they have much more power than they really have. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways of nurturing that illusion, of course, is to not look outside your own boundaries, which throws me into a sort of chronic quandary that I would like to hear your thoughts about. If you read, let's say, if you read the White House tapes, if you read the dialogues among Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, you're seeing the formation and the reinforcement of the boundaries of a small group, analogous to the groups you've been talking about. What is the ontological reality of that sense of power that those people have? Is that illusory, or is there anything there at all? Clearly, if we look at expressive culture, it happens, as you keep saying very rightly, it happens on this scale that you're describing. It doesn't happen on a national scale, which is the great problem about national ownership of cultural mm-hmm. goods. But where is the reality of groups larger
yep.
than the groups you're talking about?
Right. Excellent question. It's an excellent question because it is connected to precisely what I'm doing this year on my sabbatical. I'm currently writing a book called Tiny Publics, and so it presents this theory of small group culture, but also the question of reverberations. That is, how it is foolish, it is wrong to think of society as consisting only of small groups. We all know that it isn't, that there are forms of power, forms of constraint that channel our behavior and channel the way that we are treated in various conditions of surveillance and so forth. And so what is that process? And so the question is of spiraling out of groups, group cultures. And I talked about this briefly, although it wasn't the focus of this talk. That is, I think the way to think about this is to see society as constituted by a network of groups. Now, that is still not enough to say, well, there are all of these groups out there and they intersect. They are a network of groups with differential authority, differential resources, and differential forms of institutional power. So the Supreme Court is a small group. It has a culture. The members of the group, you know, I think I recall there was a paper in one of the Folklore meetings on the folklore of the Supreme Court, a very interesting paper, although I can't remember the author now, but making this point. But even though it's a group, it is a group whose decisions, whose output has enormous reverberations on, I would tempt to say people, but really what I'm arguing, on groups of people at various points in the social order. And this is the case for Nixon and Haldeman or Obama and Axelrod, or, you know, whichever political leaders you want to talk about, Hitler and his associates, you know, people with power that we admire, people with power that we hate. They're in the position whereby they can affect other groups. And that's in fact, that's one of the interesting arguments as to the question of how is dictatorship, how is tyranny possible? You know, why is it that someone like Stalin could control 250 million people? Stalin, who was, you know, in a way, I mean, Hitler was this evil theorist. Stalin wasn't really an evil theorist in quite the same way, that he would decide on any given day that he would kill off the engineers who ran the trains in the Soviet Union. It didn't make any sense in terms of Marxist theory. So how was he able to cow all these millions of people? Well, he did it because he had a group, and each member of that group that was surrounding him had a group of supporters that they gave resources to, and so on down the way. And this is an argument back from the 17th century about the power of groups in maintaining a tyrannical society. So, yeah.
My name is David Samper, and the hidden agenda of my question is to get you to talk about rumors, which is where I kind of intersect with your work. In this cultures of expertise, I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how maybe a rumor can be a form of collective cultural expertise. You know, being in the know, we know what really happened in this event because we can share in this rumor. You know, rumors happen in these very small groups that you talk about, but because they are telling a rumor, not he or she necessarily, we're also kind of imagining ourselves in a much larger group of people while only participating in maybe a small community. Right. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how your work on rumor ties into your presentation today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it takes me back to my first book, Rumor and Gossip, Social Psychology of Hearsay, back in 1976. And part of the argument that we were making there had to do with the exchange function of information. And therefore, if you're talking about the exchange function of information, you're focusing on groups. That the rumor teller is hoping, by virtue of a display of knowledge, of expertise, to gain deference, to gain status from those that she or he is communicating to. So, you know, that occurs. I mean, rumor is simply a form of truth claim. You know, it doesn't have an independent ontological standing except for what various communities will give it. That is, we can define this claim as being fact, as being rumor, as being fantasy. And we do it based on what Bill Ellis and Pat Turner and I have spoken of as the politics of plausibility and the politics of credibility. So do we feel that this claim, in light of the other things that we believe is plausible, and do we believe that the claim, by virtue of the person who's communicating it, is credible? So that would be some ways that I would connect this.
I'm Moira Smith. As long as you have the bully pulpit, I can't resist asking this question. In the hierarchy of academic disciplines, sociology, while not at the top, is certainly several notches above folkloristics. So I'd like to ask you, as a sociologist, what can sociology teach, the discipline of sociology teach the discipline of folklore about how to succeed in academia without really trying?
Well, you know, I did state that folklore was my beloved discipline. And when you're dealing with one's beloved, you think that they are absolutely at the peak, at the zenith. You know, we had this conversation a little bit last night, Moira and I and a few others. And, you know, I think that if we look at academic politics, you know, first of all, we have to distinguish between life in the academy, in university settings, and other roles that professions and disciplines can play, and in many cases that is outside of academic life. So that folklore, for example, since the bicentennial, has a very active public folklore side to it, and has embraced that in ways that, in many ways, are positive for the discipline, but in some ways may have separated folklore from academic politics. Sociology has done that far less, but you need really a fully comparative analysis, because psychology, for example, has a very strong public presence and a very strong academic presence. So, you know, I think there is work there for certainly a PhD candidate in sociology to understand folklore's position as a discipline, but I hope also for folklorists as well to look at, as we occasionally do, the folklore of folklore and how that folklore connects us and separates us from other audiences that we might wish to reach.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk. My name is Peter Holloway. I just had a question as to how experts arise in groups which are don't have such a fixed endpoint. The mycologist, the expert there, if a lot of people died, they may lose their prestige. Similarly, in the kitchen, if a lot of people died after eating, they may lose their position. What if it's a good example would be the art, you talked about experts in art groups or something like that. How do they hold on to their position? How are they evaluated in a more tenuous, less defined endpoint?
Well, I mean, of course, you know, reputation tends to proceed smoothly unless there are particular ruptures. And the ruptures can be positive or negative ruptures. So that, you know, in the case where we were talking about Web 2.0, if something goes viral, and in a positive way, that individual can gain social esteem. And of course, in a negative way as well. I've written about scandal. And scandal, in a way, talks to your issue. That is, here you have a situation in which things are proceeding normally and status is stable, and then something happens. Now, a scandal is different than a crime. I think they're overlapping, but they're not identical. There are crimes that are not scandals, scandals that are not crimes. And I think what happens often in a scandal case, and maybe related to your question, is that new audiences now are brought in to judge. So that people, we never gave much consideration to deep water drilling, to BP. It was just a company. It was, we had no knowledge of it. Well, when it is brought to our attention that we are looking at these things within a boundary that we had been excluded. And often you find in scandals that what a scandal consists of is a new audience judging things that have gone on all along. So, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, that was the basis. I now teach a course on scandals and reputations. I started it in 1998. Thank you, William Jefferson Clinton. But there are plenty of others, Democrats and Republicans. And what happens with Bill and Monica is, it's kind of routine for powerful men. What makes it special is that suddenly an audience that is outside of that realm now sees what is routine inside it. Then it becomes a scandal unless it affects reputation. And
Hi, my name is Steve Winnick, and I enjoyed your talk very much also. And I think you put your finger on something with identifying the three kinds of expertise. But one of the things that I've noticed, it's an observation that comes primarily from the music world, where the performative experts are musicians, the connoisseurs are sort of the crazy record collector people, and there's also the critical folks, either folklorists or critics. And so they all have their own kind of expertise, but the interesting thing is that a lot of the time, each of those groups thinks that the other kinds of expertise are, somewhat less useful, or they think the others are full of crap, basically, is the way you'll often hear it expressed when you're talking to people. And especially if you straddle more than one group, you find that quite funny. You'll find the musician saying, well, what does he know? He's never played the accordion. And you find, critics who say, well, all he can do is play the accordion. He doesn't know anything about the other aspects of all of this. So the question is, how are these kinds of, I think it opens up the question of lay and expert knowledge in the sense that everybody thinks they're the expert and that the other folks are the lay people. And I wonder how you've witnessed that being negotiated in some of your ethnographies.
yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's something that, obviously not something that I talked about, but something that is very important. That is the connections among cultures, groups that have ostensibly similar interests. And my colleague, Robert Stebbins, who's a sociologist at the University of Calgary, talks about a system of what he calls serious leisure. In serious leisure, you have essentially, you have the public, you have the amateur, the lover, the root of that word, and you have professionals. And so the question is, how will this public, which often sees these realms of serious leisure as being rather esoteric and weird and funny maybe, or even dangerous, how they see that in light of the amateur who knows so much about it in descriptive terms. And then what is the relationship between the amateur and the professional? And all of these involve systems of deference, and particularly with the amateur and the professional. In my book, Morale Tales, one of the chapters looks at the role of the professional professional mycologist in this system. Occasionally you will have certain, mostly men, but occasionally women, who as professors will go to these forays and will hang out with the amateurs. And what is expected is that the amateurs will treat them as they talk as gods, mushroom gods. And that's their language, and so you bow before the great Buddha, as it were. That's probably a terrible mixed metaphor, bowing before, but the point hopefully is made that And if you don't have that, and in fact, in the groups themselves, when I would hang out with amateurs and they talk about professionals, they'd say how snooty they were and how they weren't really concerned. They didn't really care about the mushrooms and they didn't care about the environment. And then the professionals said, well, these amateurs, all they want to do is go out and eat this stuff and tramp through the woods, and that they didn't care about the environment. So you do have that dilemma. It's something we need to talk about more.
Christy Wilsey. So you allude to the fact that all of us being part of relatively confined social spheres sometimes results in misunderstandings. The election results come back and you say, I can't understand it. Everybody I know voted for the other guy. And it seems as if it's not just that we all live in very small, in tiny publics, but that we all believe those tiny publics to be much larger than they actually are. So sociologically speaking, is there some practical reason for us to, considering that this does result in so many misunderstandings, to think that what we have access to, our relatively homogeneous group is in fact the homogeneous group that everyone is a part of?
Right. The theme of my talk was, I'm you. Right? So, and I don't want to tell you about high school. Yeah, well, there was a black mass, and not worth it. Okay. At any rate, so you're right. The famous quotation that I think you're referring to, and I don't think this quotation is apocryphal, but I don't think it was the first of the kind. Pauline Kael, who was the film critic for The New Yorker, commented after the 1972 election. She said, I don't know how Nixon could have won. If you remember, this is when he beat McGovern. So she didn't understand how Nixon could have won that election because no one she knew voted for Nixon. Right? And I think she said something like that. I'm probably misstating it a little bit, but it is your point that if we are embedded in particular networks, we see the world through those, rose-colored glasses of the network. And often we will not recognize those things that others believe. And this is, Pat Turner is so influential in making this point, and Pat and I did in our book, looking at rumors and looking at the difference among what whites believe and what whites take for granted and what blacks take for granted, and they are very different things. So that an African American can listen to a rumor about gangs very widely spread in white communities, and they would say, oh, well, that's obviously racist. And then white Americans would listen to something in African American communities about genocide, and they would say, well, these people are obviously paranoid. I don't think it's fair either to say it's racist or paranoia. There may be a bit of both, but it's really a question of what people consider plausible given their communities. And that's how we judge, what makes sense in the world. Yep.
Yes, I'm Outi Lehtipuro, and I returned to something that we had discussed, emailed about after Athens ISF Congress. I wonder if, when there has been talk about the folklorist position between the group and greater society, I wonder if American perspective is somehow different from those who live in smaller and more homogeneous countries. I found very attractive a concept presented recently by a Finnish philosopher who has written a book of the philosophy of sociology, so-called we mode. He argues that in societies people can think differently, but in some matters we have a common opinion. And in Finland it is very easy to see what those things are. And somehow within these spheres, these we mode spheres, also can be folklore that concerns masses of people. Mm-hmm. How do you think about folklore for the masses?
Right. And Oti is referring, I think, to Amala's research, the philosophy of sociality. At least is that the philosopher? There's a very fine book if you're interested in the connection between philosophy and folklore. Sociology, the philosophy of sociality. Is that the book you're referring to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and because there is also a link to the small. Thinking about a psychiatrist friend of mine said that it is a common opinion in the profession that people act differently and feel differently depending in a sphere that are we.
Yeah.
And it's
Right.
kind of psychological.
Right. Yeah,
fact.
and this is a challenge for social psychologists because we who operate on the micro level of analysis, on the group level of analysis, we want to believe that all things are groups. Give a boy a hammer and everything becomes a nail, and everything becomes a group. But there are other ways of seeing the same phenomenon, not just as a network of groups, which is what I present with you here, but that in a Durkheimian sense, a sense of social facts, that society has its meaning itself. And here I rely on, in some of my writings, the work of the political scientist Benedict Anderson, who wrote about imagined communities. And if you haven't read that and you're interested in the folklore of nationalism, I certainly encourage you to look at his book. And so he is talking about how it is that nations can feel an intimate, an emotional connection with each other. How does that imagined sense of belonging come together? And the way I would approach it, but it is definitely not the only way, and there's no one right way, is to talk about how groups serve as the basis of shared connections, and then how we generalize our belief to the existence of other groups that we believe think just like us.
I think we have time for one more question if someone has a race to the...
Oh, maybe.
Oh, hi.
Okay, we have time for two. We have time for two more questions.
I was just thinking, just a comment when you were talking before about differential roles. I was just thinking about the Chilean miners and how they organize themselves into groups. But anyway, so my question is about, I was just thinking how your model could apply to groups of artisans who largely work in isolation, or maybe just one or two people in an atelier, or maybe in a family situation. And so in your model, would their groups be, small group be other artisans, such as potters, who they might never see, or just kind of know they're there, maybe see once a year at a professional meeting, or is it between them and their customers, or is it between them and their Native American group, or how would your model apply to artists who work largely in isolation as opposed to musicians who maybe perform a lot more?
Right. Okay, so we go back to expertise. We don't necessarily need to have, say, doctors, in groups of doctors. You can have a doctor in one town, they would have some sense that they belong to a group that is not necessarily within the same geographical small space. But also they are part of the community. And so one of the things that I emphasized in the last part of the talk is that groups are internally differentiated, that they rely on a division of labor, a division of expertise. And so that artisan, even though that artisan may be the only one in that community, is part of the community. And so, connects within that culture, as well as having an occupational culture, which, it doesn't mean that academics have to live next door to each other. that there are occasions in which we think of ourselves as academics and occasions on which we think of ourselves as residents of a particular neighborhood or people who engage in a particular leisure activity.
Right. It's a very great chance, to meet you. I'm Masafat Farradi Baba. I come from Ethiopia. I think we have been writing, but we have never met. My question is, the last 9 or 10 months, I was collecting my data for my PhD that I started in Ethiopia, but that I was forced, to quit for some political reasons. And then it was just in July that I was relocated to Atlanta University Center. When I was in the field, because my study, is about folklore and resistance, I just wanted to, bring to you 3 short anecdotes. One is, sometime I attended a court where father and children were engaged in some kind of argument that the children were refusing to pay back their debts to their father. So the case was brought to court. And now there were people said to be witness and put forward what they knew about the case. And when they were giving their words before the judge, so the judge has to be sure if they were telling the truth or the lie. And these people, the so-called witnesses, when they were to tell the truth, they were swearing by calling the names of the saints of Orthodox churches nearby. When they were telling the lie, when they were telling the lie, they were swearing by the names of the saints of the churches nearby. In Salale, in there, in every Kabbalah, in every region, in every village, there are about 3, 4, 5 churches, Orthodox churches. Whereas, when they need to tell the truth, they swear by the saints of the traditional religion that they pay tribute to, celebrate at their home, in their respective village. So the judge asked me, after the case was over, what the hell that this meant to you as one who is interested in studying folklore and resistance. That was one incident. The second incident was I rented a house, and this person who rented the house to me came to be my informant. And one morning, we were sitting and discussing this and that. His name is Gurmu. He is 78 years old. He is visually impaired. And a boy came carrying skin and hide from the market and put the hide in the store and went away. And Gurmu said, after the boy went away, Asafa, yes, do you know what this boy did to me sometime? What? I brought him as part of my children because his parents are poor. But sometime he started stealing things, right? And then I sent him away. Then he told me a short story, just a brief tale. In my tradition, in our tradition, in the Oromo, we do not kill the dogs that we bring up. But what we do is, we put a butter on the forehead of the aging dog, so that the poor animal, the poor dog, smells the butter that is painted on his forehead and went away, goes away in search for the butter, as if it is located somewhere away. Then we shut the door. The dog dies out. But we cannot dare, I mean, in a way, we don't dare to kill an animal that we bring up from when it is puppy. And my point is, I just meant, to bring these three incidents, but let me cut short. But when I think of, as it happened to me, I mean that unfortunately, I came to be interested in resistance, in merging the two, folklore and resistance, about how the powerless, how the marginalized social group articulate their grievances peacefully.
Right.
That if at all we can use folklore as a nonviolent means of peace by peaceful means. Right. If ever folklore can serve as peaceful by as a means of maintaining peace by peaceful means. I mean.
Right.
But yeah, such tiny local experts.
Exactly.
Right. Where do we locate?
Okay. So
I'm sorry. I mix it up.
No. It is a very good point. And first, let me begin by telling you a book that if you don't know, you should know. It is by a professor of law named Robert Ellickson. I can give you the specific reference. It's called Order Without Law. And it speaks directly to the point that you're raising. That is, how do communities, he's looking at communities in which there are farmers and ranchers, and they have different interests in terms of letting the animals graze widely, when they graze onto farms and there's conflict. And so he's looking at the ways that communities create traditions that mediate these problems. I think the issue of resistance is one, clearly it's one that I didn't talk about in this address. It's one I've thought some about because sometimes groups, in this talk I've kind of presented groups as always happy and always in agreement. We know that from our own families. Sometimes it's not entirely true. If we don't know it from our families, we know it from our departments. At any rate, that there are these conflicts, and we have to figure out how we as folklorists can theorize the differences, how a group maintains itself as a group despite being internally differentiated and split. And then you have the first example in particular in terms of, how do we perform dishonesty? That if we're telling the truth, we use one set of saints, and presumably they're the saints that could really get us if we lied, and then another group for when we're not telling the truth. So it's all very interesting. And thank you.
Thank you, Gary.